Hello and welcome to this video, which will cover the Industrial Revolution. Now, this is the first of a series of videos I'm doing. I'm revising an old set of lectures I had on industrialization. And the point here is to address this topic from a specifically environmental point of view. So without further ado, we're going to hop into this. Today, I hope to cover really just the introduction to the topic to get us set up for a second, third, and possibly even a fourth video where I'll cover industrialization in its many different aspects. It is, of course, one of the most important phenomena over the past 200 years, and so it deserves a full and careful treatment. Now, to begin, I think it's reasonable for us to ask just what industrialization really is. How we actually propose to define this term and what we will mean by this. Now, over the course of this first lecture, I won't offer a comprehensive answer to this question, but I will get us set up to understand the answer that I will give in a future session. What I will do today is provide a bit of the historical, and theoretical context for industrialization. We've got to consider how people in the past have understood this particular phenomenon and how we might apply methods of environmental history to get a new approach, to get a new perspective on this incredibly important phenomenon. So I think the place to begin in terms of the background is to recognize that industrialization comes out of this time period that I have loosely called the late agrarian age. This is roughly from about the year 1000 to up to about 1800. And, by calling it the late agrarian age, I don't mean to say that agriculture didn't really exist before, or that important components of agricultural societies would not continue to exist after. But I think it is useful to recognize this period of time before industrialization as a moment in which there's a particular global expansion of agrarian states. Now, what I mean by that are governments and their societies whose basis was agriculture. And we can look at that and we can see societies in which land ownership was the dominant form of wealth. Think medieval Europe. Many parts of, say, early modern India, lots of places around the world where ultimately what separated the haves from the have-nots was who owned and controlled land. The cultivation of cereal grains or other staples, potatoes would be an example, those are the main occupation of the population in an agrarian society. It's not that they don't do other things. It's not that literally everybody farms, but it's kind of the default. It's the foundation, right? Now, environmentally speaking, the central occupation of an agrarian state at this point was creating, maintaining, and expanding grain ecology. And this might be carried out in a range of ways, but we expect to see things like forest clearance. For example, look at examples of China, examples of Russia in the early modern period, where forest clearance is a major component of state activity. We might consider wetlands drainage, that is, the transformation of swamps into farmable land. We see examples of this from Southeast Asia in what is today Vietnam. There are plenty of examples from East Asia, China. Examples would also include early modern Germany and early modern England, where there's quite a bit of this kind of drainage where they have swampy landscapes. They want to find ways to remove water so that they can plant. And these kinds of projects are much too large for individual or even relatively powerful landowners to undertake. They almost always require some kind of state assistance or sponsorship. And finally, we see irrigation of more arid lands. And again, here, there's a long, long history of irrigation sponsored by the state in order to produce grain or other staple growing landscapes. Look no further than the Middle East. We could see this in, say, the ancient Mesopotamia, in parts of Egypt. We might see it in regions of South Asia with the construction of various sorts of water tanks and canals. there's a ton of this stuff. So there's lots of landscape change. Now, this is a system that certainly features local instability. There are famines, there are wars, there are plagues. In the case of famines, remember that as a sort of rule of thumb, we might keep in mind that agrarian society, sort of pre-industrial farming-based societies, their crops fail something like 1 year out of 5. So it's certainly known to them that there are problems, instability happens. But at a systemic level, by this point, the idea of a sort of agriculturally based state is relatively stable. And we can see this in that there is a constant incremental expansion of the area that is under the plow or under the control of those who are reliant on the plow. Okay, now, before we actually get to industrialization, we have to recognize that there are several really crucial developments that set this up within the context of this late agrarian age. The first is that human population grows. Before 1800, before the growth that gets to 1800, historically, going back several thousand years, there were previous highs of human population globally at about 350 million. You might have a high point and then you might witness some plagues or some famines. It might drop down a little bit. But if you're looking at sort of the ancient world through the Middle Ages, you're looking at up to about 350 million. Now, something happens. Well, several things happen in the centuries leading up to 1800 so that human population roughly triples. It gets to about 1 billion people by 1800. Of course, these figures are highly speculative because we just don't have really solid ways to count, but there are lots of indicators from a range of different sources so that we can make decent guesses. And even if these numbers are off by a bit, it is definitely clear, as I'll show by the end of this video, that population was in fact growing substantially up to 1800. The second really crucial development in these centuries is the globalization and proliferation of species around the world. Some of these species are domesticated, some are not. This is what we would call, in part, the Columbian exchange, and I'll come to that in a moment. It's the movement of species, things like horses, wheat, diseases, a whole variety of other things back and forth across oceans, really connected to the expansion of global trade that occurs in the centuries before 1800. And finally, very crucial in this whole period is there's an expansion of the role of markets as means to organize human activity. They tend to degrade or sometimes outright displace customary or more traditional means of organizing human activity, such as moral economies. Generally, in order to explain the first of these developments, we would point to the second and third. I think there would be reasonable cause for debate as to how much these things matter. There's certainly some wrinkles, but I think generally we could say fairly safely that the globalization and proliferation of species around the world and the expansion of markets combined to at least make possible the growth of human population. This does not necessarily mean that people were better off, but there were many more people. Now, to consider these phenomena in turn, we might begin with the Columbian, sort of Columbus expansion into the Atlantic. Here's a painting from John Vanderlyn, The Landing of Columbus from 1836. Now, this is obviously a sort of allegorical, sort of hagiographic view of Columbus. Note the Native Americans who are depicted as worshiping him, who are sort of naked and hiding in the trees. Note as well the people in the lower left corner who seem to be grasping for something. There's a lot going on in this painting, but suffice to say that Columbus marks a dramatic shift in how we think about agriculture and the development of trade around the world. What does globalizing agriculture actually look like? Well, in the centuries leading up to 1500, from roughly Columbus until roughly the French Revolution, agriculture is, of course, already present in many places around the world. It's a widely spread phenomenon and has been for a long time. But Columbus, I think, really marks an important shift from seeing the same patterns in worldwide locales to seeing active connections between those locales. It's one thing if we say, yes, there's a development of agriculture in Peru and there's a development of agriculture in India, but it's another thing to say people in India begin to grow things that were originally from Peru, and even another thing to say people in Peru might be wearing clothing that was manufactured in India, right? So those are the differences between seeing a pattern of worldwide activities versus seeing the actual connections between these places. One scholar has called the opening of direct contact the closing of the seams of Pangea. You know, if you think of sort of global agriculture and like global geography, of course, the Atlantic Ocean exists because there's a huge geological rift at the bottom of it, tearing the continents apart. And for many millions of years, the organisms on the two sides of the Atlantic were disconnected from each other. With Columbus, they rejoin one another and begin to connect directly. We describe this as the Columbian Exchange, the transfer and proliferation of species back and forth across the Atlantic. I mentioned a few already, some key species, cattle, wheat, sugar, which becomes, is an old world crop, but becomes very profitable and spreads a great deal in the New World. And then germs, of course, which is certainly not domesticated, but they are what James Scott might call a commensal species, a species that exists with human beings, whether we like it or not. And the arrival of old world germs in New World societies, as I discuss in my video on the Atlantic world, leads to the demographic collapse of indigenous America. It's about a 90% decline in population over the course of about 150 years. This, of course, leads almost directly to the inauguration of the transatlantic slave trade, which results, of course, in plantation agriculture in the New World, as well as a massive transfer of silver from American mines into sort of global commerce. Now, when we talk about the shift in the sort of patterns that we see from seeing the same phenomena in different places to seeing active connections, this is exactly what I mean. We go from saying, yes, there's farming in multiple places, maybe they're more alike or more different, certainly interesting comparisons to be made. But by the 18th century, and certainly by the end of the 18th century, there are active connections so that the price of goods in one place, India, China, France, could be affected by changes in supply or demand from other places, the Caribbean, North America, Peru, right? There are active connections. There are literally hundreds of ships, even thousands, crossing the Atlantic every year, rounding Africa to go into the Indian Ocean, traveling from the Indian Ocean into the China Sea and through the Pacific Ocean. So we see active connections, real people, real materials, real things moving around the world and being exchanged. But this is all happening largely on the backs of agriculture. There's not really industry as we will come to understand it until well after 1800. Now, let me show a good illustration, I think, of what a sort of agriculturally based global world might look like or might produce. So for this, what I want to do is consider one of my favorite paintings. We'll consider a map first. Here's a good indication, a good illustration of the many different kinds of goods that are moving around. Now, this particular map really prioritizes European empires. Note that, Africa, much of Asia is described as essentially empty territories. There's a few names in a few places, but for the main, for the most part, like they're not really acknowledged as places that have much going on. And of course, this is incorrect. This would be a wildly incomplete look at human history, human trade at this point. Nevertheless, I think it does illustrate how at least Western Eurasia and the North Atlantic had come to organize themselves in a series of trade routes based on markets for these kinds of goods. Not free markets. The markets at this point are almost always tightly controlled and managed by monarchical states. But notice the wide varieties of various goods. Textiles, spices, coffee, sugar is a massive commodity at this point. There's all kinds of goods that are moving around the world. Now, now to my favorite painting, one of my favorite painting, Joseph von Aken's painting, An English Family at Tea. This is not a painting you might look at and say it's objectively incredible, but I always felt that this painting captured a great deal of the dynamics of the creation of the Atlantic world and the pre-industrial centuries. And you could see it in a few ways. So first, this family is possibly merchants, possibly also aristocrats. Aristocrats, of course, being landowners. If they were merchants, they were certainly imitating many aristocratic fashions, because in the pre-industrial world, and arguably well beyond, the landowning class were in many ways the ones who set the fashion trends. They set the sort of cultural trends. And so the goal of many merchant families at this point was certainly to make money, but the idea was to make enough money that they could buy land and become big landowners. So we might recognize then that the actual foundation of much of the wealth depicted here is the land. And you see it in this little girl eating bread and butter, where you have, it's literally the grain and the produce of animals from the lands, possibly right outside wherever this was painted. That is, at a very basic level, the foundation of wealth in societies at this point. Now, beyond this, we see a whole set of indicators of conspicuous consumption. So one, obviously, is they're drinking tea. The tea itself had to come from China. China was the only place that was producing tea at this point. People in India do begin to grow tea, but not for at least 100 years after this point. And they don't really get good at it for a bit longer. So they're clearly drinking tea. It might as well be coffee, could be hot chocolate. Those were all what we call the drug crops, stimulants from the tropical world that Europeans and many others found really quite delightful. The tea is almost certainly sweetened with sugar, which is, of course, a tropical plantation crop grown almost certainly by slaves. And there's the silver of the tea set here, which reminds us of the importance of mining in the Atlantic world and the way that slave labor was used in the Spanish Empire, especially to mine silver in places like Mexico and Peru, producing enormous quantities of silver that lubricated much of the global economy. And to reemphasize the idea of this as a pre-industrial kind of world, virtually all of this labor is done by hand. All of the silver here is dug out of the earth with hand tools. The tea is grown, cultivated, cut, shipped, processed, all of that with hand tools almost exclusively, right? And that would be true of everything here. So here we've got a little portrait of the Atlantic world, the way that Europe and its New World colonies and its African contacts had dramatically expanded the amount of commerce and the proliferation of species in part of the world. Now here, let me shift gears very slightly, or at least shift perspectives, and point us at the eastern side of Eurasia, where we see many similar phenomenon. Now, it is true that Ming and later Qing China did not engage in widespread overseas colonization, but they did adopt many species that were American in origin, especially the sweet potato, but also things like chilies, tomatoes. There's a whole range of them. Rice is old world, but things like maize come to be used. There's tons of different species that were native to the New World, but found a very profitable and a very fertile home in places like East Asia or South Asia. And in particular, a phenomenon that we see of considerable interest in East Asia, especially, is the intensification of land use. Because what's really happening here is that populations are growing, and the populations are learning new ways to use, modify, and intensify their use of land in order to get more things out of it. Remember that population around the world roughly tripled in these centuries. And that kind of intensification is really only possible with a more intense, more labor intensive, especially use of land. And we might see that in something like this, in this kind of terraced agriculture. A major phenomenon that we see in these centuries is often with the blessing and outright support of the Chinese imperial state, cultivators on sort of the frontiers would find ways to cultivate higher and higher up into hillsides. And it might look something like this. Okay, so we arrive at this point then late in the 18th century, where, as one scholar has called it, there is a world of surprising similarities. And we find a series of factors true at both ends of Eurasia. As I pointed out a moment ago, there's a high degree of commercialization here. And by that, I mean that markets for commodities, but also for land, for labor, for capital, these kinds of markets are coming to play a bigger and bigger role in how human activity is organized. And while this is not universally a benefit, markets don't always produce more efficient uses of materials. They often do. And in this case, I think we definitely do see that there is at least an intensification of agriculture and production driven in many ways by markets. And there's essentially high degrees of commercialization right across the world. We see it in Western Europe. We see it in East Asia. We certainly see it in South Asia. It's present in the Middle East. It's present in regions of Africa. It's present in many of the regions of European settlement in the New World. It's all over the place. Okay, beyond the commercialization, we see as well a relatively high degree of specialization, so that individuals are certainly developing more specialized skills. Firms, businesses are doing that. And from an environmental perspective, especially, we see environmentally specific products. We see whole regions, for example, the Caribbean, that become essentially devoted to the plantation cultivation of a relatively small range of crops, especially sugar. Cotton would be another. So we're seeing a kind of global division of labor that had never existed. Now, relative to what comes in the 19th and the 20th, and especially the 21st centuries, the degree of global specialization is small, but it is real. It is certainly happening. And as I pointed out, we're seeing more and more intensive land use practices. Now, the land use practices that are intensified are often in what we call core regions. At the peripheries, we're often seeing more extensive land specialization, so that core regions would find new ways to use what land they had more intensively, while at the peripheries, there were often extensive tracts of land that could be used as extensive tracts of land. Think, for example, of ranching, which takes up a great deal of land with not that much labor, but in, say, the New World, where there's considerable depopulation due to disease, there are large amounts of land that have relatively few people on, and hence they can ranch and raise animals on an absolutely immense scale, on a scale that was very difficult to find in the Old World. And lastly, we often see in these societies at this point cultural values that reflect the prioritization of agriculture. That is, as I mentioned, landowning elites. Elite status is defined by their control of land. And the sort of other side of the coin is that the non-farming peoples of the periphery would typically be seen as barbarians, as others of some kind, whether these are horsemen from Central Asia, whether they are indigenous peoples of the forests of the New World or of Africa. They are often people who don't farm, are seen by farming people as some variety of uncivilized, not human. Okay. Important to note that right through 1750, indeed, arguably perhaps as late as 1830 or even 1850, China remains probably the most developed region in the world, most developed in the sense that it had the highest degree of commercialization, the highest level of specialization of labor, and in some cases of landscapes. China remains essentially the driver of the global economy, and it will remain that into the 19th century. So what changes? What is it that brings about such a profound transformation that we prioritize and care about industrialization so much? Well, industrialization dramatically increases the amount of stuff that people have access to. You can see here a graph of population. And notice that there is substantial growth in those centuries from, say, 1000 to about 1800 or so. And then that growth simply skyrockets. The growth explodes, right? And not only does it explode, but today there are about 7.5 times as many people on the earth as there were in 1800. And on top of that, each individual has, on average, 10 to 15 times more things, more stuff. Now, it is divided up, it is distributed incredibly unequally, more unequally than at any point in the past. But still, something really critical happened just before, around, and then after 1800 to allow 7 times more people, 10 to 15 times more stuff per person. Clearly, something is different. Now, when I think of industrialization, it is really that fundamental shift, the increase of people and the increase of things, that I think defines it most. It is, in a way, it's the transformation from a world marked by poverty to a world marked by abundance, or say marked by scarcity to marked by abundance. Poverty, of course, obviously continues to exist. So how do we explain this? Well, there's a lot of traditional explanations, and here is an illustration of one. This is James Watt. He's the inventor of the steam engine. Now, this is a picture done in 1860. Watt actually invented the steam engine more than 100 years previous to this, but think of this particular explanation for the growth of wealth in the world, for the growth of abundance. Think of this as the Elon Musk explanation. And by that, I mean, it's an explanation that basically says smart dudes invented things. It prioritizes the technological changes of industrialization and essentially says everything flows from these changes in technology. And there's certainly something to this, but this is a deeply misleading explanation for industrialization. Note the way that in the image, Watt sits here and he stares at his kettle, and he's the idea is that he's this incredible engineering mind. He's got his engineering materials over here. He's drafting something. He stares over at the kettle, probably thinking about Boyle's laws of thermodynamics, and is struck by the possibility of capturing the energy contained in water and released as it turns into steam to drive an engine, right? All of the power of transformation is then focused on his mind, his face. This is the thing that is directly in the center. And we sort of see it with the combination of his intent gaze with his hand, the sort of object, the tool of his work right next to his face and his mind. Everything is bound up in the individual here. Now, what does this view have in favor? Well, in favor, people did invent things. It is difficult to say that people did not. That would obviously be incorrect. We could point to the steam engine. We could point to the whole range of inventions that industrialized textile manufacturing. We could look at inventions in metalworking, say the Bessemer process, which makes steel much cheaper. We could point to the many innovations in chemicals that occurred, especially after 1860, when people learned to derive all kinds of synthetic chemicals from relatively few sources. These inventions happen. They are real. However, the problem is that they don't happen by themselves. And that, I think, really is the problem with most histories that prioritize a single technology, or that prioritize technology in the abstract, or that really focus on human genius. Because whatever genius James Watt may have possessed, and certainly his invention was and remains useful, it never occurs on its own. It's never outside of its social and especially its environmental context. So let me propose then the second version. This is the kind of second traditional story of industrialization. This is what we might call the Karl Marx view. And the Marx view is really that industrialization is essentially a story of labor, that it's about work. And in particular, it's about how workers come to be organized, deployed, and depending on how you sort of evaluate the story, exploited to harness incredible productive powers. Now, here we see an iron mill from Adolf Menzel. He's a German painter. Germany, of course, industrializes very rapidly in the 19th century. And so Menzel is here painting, and I think trying to capture some of the experience that he witnessed growing up in, seeing industrialization before his eyes. And while there's certainly technology here, what's really at work in this painting is the labor. And you can see it in, if you look right in the center of the image, we have these figures. They're standing so close together, it's kind of hard to tell them apart. Are there 6 men there? Are there 7? Are there only 5? Like, it's hard to tell, but we do see the literal muscles of their arms. We see them sort of reaching in with these tongs to pull out the hot pieces of metal. This is really a story of labor. And here again, it is very difficult to deny this. There are plenty of people whose political orientation today encourages them to treat anything that Marx might have said or anything associated with Marx as, obviously stupid and wrong. But it's very difficult to deny that the conditions of labor and the organization of labor in 19th century Europe were transformed in the 19th century. They absolutely were. There's kind of no way around this. But again, this story as well is insufficient. And if the first explanation, the Elon Musk explanation of smart dudes inventing things, if that was incomplete because it ignored the role of labor, I think the role of labor explanation is incomplete because it ignores the role of environment. And here we come to the ways that environmental history offers particular perspectives. And I think the key to understanding the environmental perspective is to consider the role of energy. What do we mean by energy exactly? Here, I think it is worth considering how environmental history has contributed to the broader study of history in general. For many decades, history was seen as an effectively political discipline. They studied political leaders. It was added to with ideas of economy and of society, eventually of culture as well, as historians sought new ways to have more comprehensive understanding of the past. What environmental history does for us is remind us that while people are very important and people do remain the center of our story, there are things on the earth that matter to people that are not people. For example, very fundamental elements of our world, things like water, things like fire, things like plants and animals, and in this case, even the abstract force that we call energy. So when I say energy and we think about what the role of energy is, I think the original question we have to ask is, where does energy on Earth come from? And it comes ultimately from the sun. The sun is, of course, the the sort of ultimate source of the energy that powers life on Earth. Everything that you see here that is green is actively photosynthesizing. Now, it's true, there are some examples of life on Earth that do not photosynthesize, but the overwhelming majority of the biosphere is things that eat sunlight directly, that is plants, things that eat sunlight directly, that is herbivores, cows, for example. And then there are things that eat things that metabolize sunlight directly, that is carnivores like us. I suppose we're omnivores because we eat plenty of plants as well, probably more plants than animals, but still, at the end of the day, everything comes from the sun. And so when we consider the role of energy and what it does for us, we use a couple of key terms. The two terms I'm going to discuss here were first developed by a scholar named Anthony Wrigley in the 1980s, and they are organic and mineral economies. Now, today, I'm not really going to go into mineral economy. Remember that term, because you will need to know it. That's for next time, though. Today, organic economy. So, according to Wrigley, you can see it most clearly in his book called Continuity, Chance, and Change, The Role of Energy in the Industrial Revolution, which was published way back in 1987, I think. He describes the concept of an organic economy. That is an economy that draws its energy from the flow of sunlight striking the earth. The sun is always on. It's always hitting the earth, bombarding the earth with energy, and plants eat that. All plants are essentially photosynthesizing. They are consuming sunlight directly. Animals, all the animals that are out there eat something that eats the sun. Whether you're birds eating seeds, whether you're small bugs that eat rotten wood or something like that, whether you're a cow that eats grass, if you're an animal, you're almost certainly eating something that grew as a plant first. But in addition to that, we might imagine weather. Any kind of weather or hydrological system is also directly from the sun. I mean, why does the wind blow? Well, the wind blows because the sun heats the Earth's crust differentially, which causes warm air to rise, causes cool air to descend. This means that the atmosphere is constantly moving around. We experience this as wind, right? Similarly, why do rivers flow? Well, rivers are the result of rain over land. And rain is, of course, caused by sunlight striking the oceans or other bodies of water, evaporating some of the water there. It turns into clouds. It drifts over land where it can condense and precipitate as rain, which then flows into rivers. So any kind of hydrological system on the earth is heavily affected by and even created by the sun. Now, as I said, mineral economies will come later. So remember the term for now, but this is our definition of organic economy. It is an economy that draws its energy from the flow of sunlight striking the earth. These agrarian economies that I've been talking about so far, what they really are mechanisms to capture more or less of that flow of energy for human use. And we see here a plan for a medieval English landholding with a sort of domain, run by a lord who lives in the manor, and then various fields broken up to provide different kinds of resources at different parts of the year. There's autumn planting, there's spring planting, where they plant various crops. There's some parts that are left fallow, that is so that the fertility can regenerate. There's woodland to provide trees. There's pasture to provide animals. So here we see a relatively small landscape that is divided up in order to produce all of the basic resources that this relatively small society needs. And this is in many ways a kind of model of an agrarian society. Something like this has existed for many thousands of years, and it relies on the flow of sunlight that strikes the earth at all times. We might consider things like water mills. If rivers are created by the sun, if we think of a river as a kind of organic energy source, there's a terrific book on this by Richard White called The Organic Machine about the Columbia River, if you're interested. What rivers do is they tap into the power of flowing water. They capture some of that motion using a wheel of some sort, and then using gearing on the inside, they transfer the motion from that wheel to some other machine, to something else, right? And the same goes for windmills, which are there to capture the energy that is contained in the moving wind, and through a series of gears, transform that energy into motion, which can then be applied to some device. In this case, it's some kind of grain mill, some kind of flour mill. You can tell because there's an old millstone, this little circle thing right here. So this weather vane here, this mill would catch the wind, it would turn, drive a crank on the inside, and it would turn millstones in order to grind grain and turn it into flour. Interestingly, I'll note as well, this is called a post mill, because if you note the strange shape of the mill, it is that particular shape because it's built on a pivot. It can actually be turned to face whatever direction the wind is blowing. And that's an interesting point, because that reminds us that these organic power systems, rivers, wind, things like that, they are very changeable. They change with the seasons, they change throughout the day. They're not really available in abundance in all areas. Some places have excellent water mills or excellent potentials for water mills. Some places are windy all the time, but lots of places are not. And hence, while this energy is kind of abundant and it's out there in the world, the sun is always going, it's not always that accessible, or it's not accessible in whatever form you might want. Now, the issue of an organic economy extends, of course, to heat as well. If we ask, well, how do people cook? How do people make things like metal or ceramic? You need heat for these things. When we consider the role of energy, energy appears in the form of heat in our everyday life all the time. It's baked into, literally, virtually everything that surrounds you right now. And when it comes to things like cooking, domestic cooking to just make food every day, that typically comes from woodlands, right? And in a society, if a society is in an environment where there's a shortage of wood, they will have trouble cooking. This, in fact, as we have seen in some previous lessons in environmental history, is a factor that can lead to the collapse of societies occasionally. If they use up their available wood supplies, they might find themselves out of fuel. And this goes especially so when you're talking about making ceramic or making something like steel. If you're trying to make steel, iron in general, steel especially, you have to get things extremely hot because, of course, iron molecules do not show up pure, right? They're always bound up inside rock, which we call iron ore. And in order to separate the actual iron from all of the other elements that it's bound up to, you have to blast it with incredible amounts of heat. You need it to be so hot, in fact, that regular wood won't cut it. You have to make charcoal. So how do you make charcoal? Well, this is one method of making charcoal, where you cut down a ton of trees, pile them up, and you burn that wood at a relatively low temperature, sort of slowly, which essentially reduces, it gets rid of a lot of impurities. It cooks off all the water that's inside wood. There's some percentage of water, and you're left with, highly combustible carbon, sort of pure carbon, which can then be reburned at a higher temperature. But this, obviously, as you can see before you, uses up a ton of wood. And a ton of wood means a ton of trees. Trees are, of course, an organic energy source. They only grow with sunlight. And one of the problems that societies run into, especially as they try to ramp up production of metal, of ceramic, of bricks, of glass, things like that. They all require heat, right? As societies try to ramp up production of these things, they often will consume their forests faster than the forests regrow. In other words, they will outpace the available flow of energy. And it's actually a relatively common phenomenon that we see in many parts of the world, in the sort of medieval and ancient world, where there'll be an ironworks open someplace. They'll have plenty of iron ore. They'll make tools and weapons and whatever else. But then after a few decades, they have to close because they have completely used up the forest around them, so much so that they simply cannot get enough fuel to continue working. And I think this really begins to point us to one of the drawbacks, like one of the real limiting factors of an organic economy. If you are reliant on sunlight, then ultimately the land is the limit. And we see this as a kind of worldwide phenomenon in the late 18th century. The fact that the land is the limit is one of the reasons that we see an intensified use of land in places like China. There was only so much land to go around, and what they were trying to do really was put more labor into their landscapes in order to produce more stuff using that land. But at the end of the day, they are essentially reliant upon the actual flow of energy from the sun. And that might appear in straight sunlight, it appears in rain, all of those things. Now, it is true that the intensification of land use, sometimes called the agricultural revolution or an agricultural revolution, there's arguably several of these, they do provide ways for people to use the land more intensively and thereby to capture more of the flow of energy. And we can see it in things like increasing crop yields. Like, it is true that by developing better farming techniques, by rotating crops especially, there is substantial growth in farm productivity, right through a lot of the Middle Ages, and especially in the early modern period. These centuries, say from about Columbus up to about 1800, are centuries of considerable growth, really based on just doing agriculture better, right? But crucially, there are certainly changes, but they tend to be rather limited. And we tend to call some of these changes proto-industrialization, almost like a pre-industrialization. This is an illustration of a glassworks from 18th century France. And here, they are reliant on wood. And so there is a sort of limit to just how much they can actually produce. Many parts of the world were seeing increases in production of all kinds of things in the 1700s. As I said, much of it is based on the increasing use of markets to incentivize activity, to organize activity, and it does certainly increase production. But while proto-industrialization is certainly a phenomenon that we see, it was still running into limits. And we can see these limits most clearly in the contemporary views of two men. You might have heard of these guys. They're very famous early economists, classical economists, Adam Smith and Thomas Malthus, essentially like subsequent generations of economists. Now, examining their views of economy in the late 1700s is very useful for understanding how things were going to change from about 1800 on. Now, to begin, I'm going to start with Malthus. He actually comes a little bit later than Smith, but I think it helps to explain them in this order. So Malthus is most famous for what's called his Essay on Population in 1798. And he was very much an Enlightenment thinker, so he sort of went from first principles and tried to reason from there. First principle, food is necessary to the existence of man. That was his first point. He said, look, everyone's got to eat. And, Marx said the same thing. I think this is widely known. Everyone's got to eat. Second, Malthus argued that the passion between the sexes is necessary and will remain nearly in its present state. Now, what he meant by this is that humans are going to have sex and they're going to have babies. Now, Malthus was incorrect in this. He assumed that the fertility rate was constant. This is something that we know today is absolutely not the case. There are lots of variables that control and affect the fertility rate. So he was wrong in this sense, but we can see how he might, we can see how this might make sense to him. And if we recognize that like these are his two operating premises, his conclusion does make sense. And the conclusion, the way he sort of reasoned through is he said, the first power is immense and infinite in comparison to the second. That's kind of a roundabout way of him saying that people would continue to have babies until they were starving. He said this implies a strong and constantly operating check on population from the difficulty of subsistence. Now, what all this means is that one of the classical economists looking at the late 18th century looked around the world and he said, wow, there's a lot of people and the number of people is always growing. And he thought sooner or later, maybe sooner rather than later, population would simply be limited only by starvation, that inequality and widespread misery were inevitable. Now, what's wild about this is that this is one of the guys responsible for literally inventing the discipline of economics. And he was living through the early stages of industrialization and did not see it at all. So what I think this tells us is that for people in the 18th century, the limits to growth and development were very much about agriculture. He saw the limit in the land. He couldn't imagine a world in which land was not the fundamental limit on everything people did. Now, someone like Adam Smith, I think, offers a good complementary perspective to Malthus, because Smith, I think, saw the same problem. After all, he did posit that land is finite. So like Malthus, Smith was also like, yeah, land is limited. There's not that much. But Smith, by imagining and giving us the really useful terms, factors of production, land, labor, and capital, these are the three things that are needed to manufacture stuff. Smith pointed out that it might be possible in some situations to substitute one of these factors of production for others. And especially, he pointed out that labor could be made more productive by specialization. And then he's got this famous story of the pin makers. He points out that if you had, just a sort of regular laborer and you taught this guy how to make pins, and then you said, okay, get to work making pins. And you gave him the tools. You were like, all right, you're going to make pins. You're like, listen, the tailors of the town are desperate. They can't sew anything without pins. You got to get on this. You train some guy to do it. He could produce a few per day. I mean, maybe 20, probably less, right? But he pointed out that if you took 20 workers and you divided up the actual steps of pin making, and you had one or two laborers doing only one step each so that everyone could focus on their specific task. Like you have some guys whose focus is just on drawing out the thin metal and just cutting it in just the right way. You've got another group whose job is just to sharpen them, something like that, right? If you do that and the workers never have to change place, they don't have to switch tools, they just do their one task over and over and over. If you do that, Smith pointed out that 20 laborers working together could make thousands of pins every day. And this sounds a bit like an assembly line. It's not quite a level of like Henry Ford Model T assembly line of the 20th century, but it does point to the way that, one, Smith agreed with Malthus that land was limited, and two, that labor could, under the right conditions, be made much more efficient. Now, could you get people to work in this way voluntarily? That's a different question, and one I hope to answer in a future video. But crucially, we see that in the late 18th century, both Smith and Malthus, the inventors of economics, really did not anticipate the staggering economic material growth that would come in the 2 centuries that followed their lives. And here I want to propose a final, as a way to end this video, I want to propose a definition of industrialization as being a matter of breaking limits. What was so apparent to these guys in the late 18th century were the limits. And that makes sense because population around the world had reached historic highs. It was 3 times higher than it had been at its previous highs, right? It had blown past expectations. But we now recognize industrialization as the breaking of 2 limits, a limit on land and a limit on energy. Now, the limit on land will be broken, perhaps only stretched, by a more intensive land use in core zones and by more extensive land uses in peripheries, combined with increased trade between these areas to essentially allow a global specialization of lands. We saw the beginnings of this in the 18th century. The 19th and the 20th century today, in the 21st century, the world is incredibly specialized. It's specialized on a scale that would be utterly impossible for people 200 years ago to imagine. And energy is, in a sense, then an essential complement to this. But how is the limit on energy broken? Well, fossil fuels. Fossil fuels, I would say, are the absolute key to understanding industrialization on a widespread, in a systemic way. And hence, we will deal with fossil fuels and what I will call the mineral economy next time. So I hope this has been a useful video. I hope this has laid a good foundation for the late agrarian world, what to expect as we move up to the period of industrialization. And I hope we get a sense of what is going to change with industrialization and how we should not look at industrialization as a kind of natural, inevitable development that would have happened sooner or later. Instead, as I hope to show next time, it's the very specific breaking of very specific limits through some technologies, some environmental conditions, some social changes. It's all of these things together that will then produce a dramatic expansion in the amount of material wealth available to the human species. Now, as you might imagine, it comes with tremendous costs, and those we will deal with in future sessions. But for now, thank you very much, and I'll see you next time.